Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. It's been another great day for British democracy. David Cameron is the latest Tory MP to become embroiled in sleaze. Corruption has pretty much become endemic in Tory circles. It's almost a way of life. It reminds me of a reply that President Abraham Lincoln gave when he was asked if his Treasury Secretary was an honest man. He said, well, I trust him not to steal a red hot stove. I'm not even sure if I would trust the present Tory administration not to steal any stove, whatever the temperature. Thanks for joining us this evening. Tonight we'll be talking to Professor Donald Christie. We'll hear what he thinks of education and how Scotland ranks in this crucial area. And we'll be talking about Brexit and cycling, as well as his thoughts on independence and so much more besides. And as always, he'll be taking your questions live. There's still time to get your question considered. The details are on the What's On guide at whatson.scot. And we'd love to hear from you. As you know, TNT stands for The Nation Talks. So you are the nation, and we'd like to hear you talk to us so that we can put your questions to Professor Christie. And we're live, and we're free. So no license, no problem. Now, to our guest tonight, The Nation Talks to Professor Donald Christie. Donald, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, John. Very well indeed. Enjoying life.
And where are you speaking from tonight?
I'm speaking from Glasgow at the moment, but I have been traveling around a little bit since things have got easier, with all due precautions, of course, pursuing my passion, which I've developed during retirement, which is for cycling, particularly cycling in the hills of central Italy, where I visit frequently. There's something quite unique about the situation there. It's a beautiful part of the world, of course. For me, cycling on roads is the thing to do. I like asphalt surfaces. The great thing about that part of Italy is that while it's quite mountainous terrain, it has little villages all over. I mean, the classic kind of hilltop villages, and also in mountainous areas which are nearby, little villages perching high up in high valleys. But all of these villages have been there for 1,000 years.
Sounds wonderful. Now, how do you get there?
They're connected up by roads, so you can stay on asphalt even in the heights of the mountains.
And how do you get there? Do you actually cycle there?
Well, I have cycled to Italy from Glasgow. That was back in the year that I retired. No, I don't make a habit of that because it took us about 5 weeks to do it, my friend and I. But no, I favor the train. I go by train. That's my way to go. It's a mixed experience going by train to Italy. To the center of Italy. The most problematic bit for me is Glasgow to London. I tend to go via Paris. London to Paris is very civilized in the Eurostar. And then from Paris, I can go direct to Milan through the Alps, a journey of about 7 hours, 7.25 hours. Very, very comfortable, very civilized, and very cheap. It's usually much cheaper to travel from Paris to Milan than it is to travel from Glasgow to London. I don't quite understand why that's the case, but that
well, I can understand it. I assume it's because these lines that you're describing in continental Europe are not privatized.
That makes a difference. It certainly does. And they take pride in their railways. The Italian railways are superb as well, from Milan down to where I go. It's a lovely trip as well, a few hours of comfort, very civilized.
And what have you seen any changes as a result of Brexit and your travels?
Well, yeah, occasionally, if ever I have had to take a flight, which occasionally happens, the sense of being deprived of one's European citizenship by being herded into a separate channel is something that I dislike. However, I will say that as far as the other countries are concerned, I've not experienced too much in the way of difficulty. I think they've been very indulgent towards visitors from the UK. I think the difference is arriving back, more precautions are required by the UK of people coming in. And it just confirms to me that Brexit is about becoming more insular, less outward looking, and altogether, in my view, a retrograde step for the country. And I bitterly resent the idea that Scotland has been dragged out against its will. And I feel it deeply.
What would your view be then in that case? Let's assume there's an independent Scotland tomorrow morning. Would you like to see that new state immediately start moves to rejoin the European Union?
I would, in actual fact, I would. It's not that I'm, uncritical of the European Union. There's many things that I would wish to see change in the EU, but I would wish to be part of the project, and I think Scotland would be a valued part of the project, which to me has been a great success during its existence. Arising out of the conflict in the middle of the 20th century. The project for peace, really, and collaboration among European countries. Having traveled across Europe on a number of trips that I've enjoyed since retiring, it's patently clear just how important that collaboration and cooperation among neighbouring countries has been. When you see the signs of the past, as you're close to the ground when you're traveling on a bike through countries, you pick up things that are happening, and clearly there are issues, and there are countries that are kind of testing the limits of their freedoms, as it were, to engage in policies and practices that are perhaps, let's say, unwelcome. Having visited, for example, Hungary a few years back, having traveled by bike from Vienna to Budapest, they were near the place where we were staying. They were erecting a new monument to the Hungarian people's role in the Second World War. And this was very kind of contentious. And, one thing about travel, especially traveling by bike, as I would advocate, you really get a sense of, what's happening on the ground. And what was very interesting was it was a very vocal and pretty persistent protest against this government initiative to, as the protesters put it, to airbrush the history and rewrite the history and create a kind of heroic past for the Hungarians during that period. And they were saying no. The protesters were strongly resisting this idea. Do not airbrush history. We must acknowledge the problematic past. And I think it's important for Europe as a whole that we look forward into an era of collaboration rather than returning to that kind of adversity.
Well, that I think a lot of people would echo your remarks there. Now, tell us a bit about your career, Donald. Now, yep. You started off as a primary school teacher, is that right?
Well, no, not exactly. That's I was a primary school teacher during a period of my life, but I started off as a researcher. My degree was in psychology, and did postgraduate research in applied cognitive psychology, some pure research and some applied research in psychology. And I had a couple of research posts. This was during the 70s and early 80s, just around that time, when the Conservative government came into power in 1979. One of the first things that Margaret Thatcher did was to rein in public spending. And she looked at the university sector at the time, which had just gone through very rapid expansion during the 60s and 70s. And she felt that was an area ripe for cuts. And so the project I was on was a project funded by the Home Office Police Scientific Development Branch into face memory. The second project I was working on, that was up in Aberdeen, in the psychology department there. And I was assured by my colleagues that the first, the 3-year contract that I had would be extended probably out to at least 6 years worth of research. And we were protected because it was the Police Scientific Development Branch that was funding that research into what became photo fit type ways of facial reconstruction. But the idea of having to renew the contract year on year, a bit for me, it was not terribly kind of secure. I was married, and I had one child already and one on the way. And so an interest that I had, of course, from my undergraduate degree was that I had studied, it was a kind of educational project that I did in my final year. And I'd always had an interest in that. And so I ducked out and did a teacher education course and became a primary teacher for a few years in Aberdeen. Before the post came up at what was then, of course, Jordan Hill College of Education. And this is an important strand, that the education as a discipline was kind of split in those years, because teacher education was in a separate sector, in the college sector, up until the 90s. And at the time, this was part of the enhancement that was taking place for the teaching profession, of which I'll say more later, because this was the era in the early 80s, in the mid 80s, when the profession became all graduate. And so they were looking for staff to come onto the primary education program. And they were looking for a lecturer in psychology who had primary education in their background. Now, there weren't too many of us around at that time. So I think it was pretty much a shoe-in for that post. But I was delighted to have the post because it allowed me to apply my psychology in a real context. And this is my passion for education, is that it's a profoundly applied field. An applied discipline. And it was very gratifying for me that in the early 90s, negotiations were starting to establish education within the university sector. And Jordan Hill College was the first to be merged in with a university, and that took place in 1993. When we became the Faculty of Education of University of Strathclyde. And
so when you taught primary, which year did you teach? Which class?
In primary, I taught various stages. in the years that I was teaching kind of middle and upper. I think primary 4 was as low down the age range that I managed to.
Now, I must task you here. And I ask this question of everyone. We've had a number of educationalists on the program. The question is this: what is the point of education?
Aha. Well, I mean, the purpose of education. This is obviously it's an important topic. How do you distill what the purpose of education is? I would say that there are. I would echo Professor Gert Biesta, who said that there are 3 main purposes. One certainly is socialization. We need to socialize, enable children to be social beings within society. And that is about engaging with others appropriately, learning to relate to others, and to be with others, and so on. There is another purpose which is about, he would describe, or some would describe, as qualification for life, preparation. So acquiring the skills that you will need to survive. I suppose that's a purpose for education.
One of the reasons I asked the question is I've got lots of friends in the business community and people who are entrepreneurs. And many of them have told me about a book by a guy called Robert Kiyosaki, who's a Hawaiian. So he has this extraordinary. He's written a book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad, in which he says, I had a poor dad, he said. And I said to him, why is my friend's dad rich as a 9-year-old and we are poor? And he said, well, I work for the government. What can I tell you? That's what the government rates are. So he said, if you want to know why he's rich, why don't you go and ask him? So he said, as a 9-year-old, I went to this guy and I said, why are you rich? And he said, well, I don't do anything. I don't take advice from anyone unless they're actually doing the thing that I'm taking the advice about.
Right.
And he said, okay, what does that mean? Because as a 9-year-old, you don't have too much critical faculty working for you there. And the guy said, well, every accountant has to be an accountant. I don't go to learn accountancy. I want to deal with somebody who has that training. And he said, that's the way I do everything. He said, it's about doing, it's not about anything else. And he's sort of echoing that old epithet, those who can do, those who can't teach. You must have heard this a million times. Indeed. What's your answer to that, Donald?
My answer to that is, honestly, teaching is a profession, and it requires skills. It requires qualification for the position. I mean, this is something profoundly important, and something that is a strong strand of what I see as the success of Scottish education, that teaching is seen as a profession. And just as the medical profession or the legal profession have their professional bodies, the General Medical Council and so on, the Law Society, in Scotland, we have the General Teaching Council, which has been in existence since 1965, looking after the standards in the profession and maintaining the high exacting standards that we have for the teaching profession in Scotland.
I mean, that's very laudable. I want to put a question to you, if I may. It's just arrived. The question is this: would you agree that there are too many organisations, academic, trade unions, and parents' groups, etc., all with an input to the education debate?
No, I wouldn't agree there are too many. I think the fact that there are many different organizations with an interest just reflects the fact that there are so many legitimate stakeholders in education. So that can make it challenging, because if you're trying to develop policy and implement policy and so on, there are many interested parties who are watching what's happening and taking an interest, and I think that's legitimate. So it's the question is how you genuinely harness those different perspectives and different voices and enable them to feel that they have a legitimate place in the discussions, and that their voice is heard. And primary among those, of course, are children's voices themselves. Children's voices, which in the past perhaps were, let's say, seen and not heard. We at least are acknowledging now the importance of listening to children's voices.
I'd like to come back to that, if I may, in a second. But here's a question. You said earlier that Scottish education is a success.
Yeah.
And yet many people reading the public prints would have come to a different view, Donald.
Yeah, that's very true. The Scottish education has definitely become a political football, and it is a matter of deep regret to me that the reality of Scottish education tends to be ignored, and what is raised are issues that concern certain groups and individuals. But when you look at Scottish education and you try to take an objective perspective on that, you will see the strengths as recognized by the others who envy what we have in Scotland. I can give you a practical example of it. In my position as the head of the School of Education in the last few years before I retired, we were delighted to welcome many new members of staff to work at the School of Education at Strathclyde. Interesting that among them were several academics from south of the border. And they had deliberately chosen to apply to come and work at Strathclyde because they wanted for their children to come to Scottish education rather than education in the English context. I won't say the English system because it's difficult to define the English system. The education system south of the border is much more disparate. We have in Scotland, largely speaking, state education run by local authorities. A very small proportion of children in Scotland actually attend independent schools compared with England. Very small. And in England, there are all sorts of other versions of how schools are governed. Now, you might say, well, that diversity is good. But in my view, what matters is the quality of education to all children. And in Scotland, we have many strengths in our system that are acknowledged. I mean, not only people choosing to come and work in Scotland and bring in their families, and I'm talking here about people who are experts in education, people within the discipline of education choosing to move north. We also have visitors from all over the world. Now, increasingly, of course, we attract teaching staff in our faculty, in our School of Education from other parts of the world. They also acknowledge and they're aware of the strengths of Scottish education, the context in which they want to be part. During my time as head of school, I can remember many, many delegations from countries all over the world, too many to count, coming to visit Scotland because of interest in the Scottish education system. For example, we had, and this was a visit organised by the General Teaching Council for Scotland, a delegation from one of the regions in Finland, whose education system is widely praised, who had come to Scotland particularly to learn about the curriculum for excellence and how it was developed and how it is implemented, because they were entering into a period of reviewing their own curriculum in Finland, and their opinions of what they saw were very positive indeed.
Donald, that's very inspiring. What would you say? What help could you suggest to people watching and listening tonight who have heard a very different version? They have heard people on the BBC and in the public prints saying things like Scottish education used to be world class in the past, but under this administration, standards have collapsed. Now, you're maintaining exactly the opposite. So where can people get information that would help them to counter some of the nonsense that they've seen in the broadcast media?
Well, there are many sources. If on a serious point about that, if people do wish to follow up and pursue the documentary evidence behind anything that I've said, I will ensure that the links are given to you, John, and you could, if people follow up their question with a request for information or a source, I would endeavour to ensure that they could access it. Obviously, things like the PISA survey are pretty reasonable. You can do a Google search and you can get access to the OECD publications around the PISA survey. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Development, Cooperation and Development, OECD, have a lot of publications on education. And as it happens, they have been involved, having been commissioned, as it were, by the Scottish Government to carry out evaluations of the curriculum and various other aspects of the education system and the improvement framework and so on. And their reports are well worth reading, because while of course there are things that could be improved, there always are things to be improved. Education is a very challenging business, and there's always room for improvement, and there's a constant cycle of reevaluation and change. But the common thread in those reports is affirmation and praise for the Scottish education system, particularly the professional standards of the teaching profession, particularly our curriculum. Well, there are ways in which things might be streamlined, things might be improved, and the notion of the inclusivity of Scottish education, the commitment to social justice, the idea of genuine collaboration in learning communities, and the opportunities for engagement with the wider community of education. These are all strengths that are frequently praised in such documents. Going back to the PISA reports, now we hear about the maths and the language and the reading and so on. and science. These are the main areas that the kind of academic subjects that are school subjects that are assessed on a cyclical basis. And much stress is placed on movements of a few percentage points on the scores on these things. I don't want to get into all of that just now, but what I would stress, and it's something that people won't be quite as familiar with, I'm sure, is that they also report in the PISA survey, they report on wider issues, including sort of global competencies. That kind of area was covered in the report, in the survey that was carried out in 2018, but the report wasn't published until last year. And it turns out that Scotland performed exceptionally well on in that particular domain of global competence. And we're talking about the sorts of attributes like being able to explore, to understand local, global, and intercultural issues, being able to kind of appreciate that others have different perspectives on things, to take appropriate action for collective well-being and sustainable development. It's those sorts of areas of competence and that sort of area of knowledge that was assessed by PISA in their global competencies framework. And being aware of the kind of need for critical awareness of issues in terms of information being provided and so on, the need for understanding other people and other cultures, all of these dimensions. Now, Scottish children came out in the top 5 countries of those who participated in that survey, and that was never reported by the media.
See, this is. I find this exceptionally interesting because the media do shape opinions. Obviously, they don't shape them utterly and totally. Otherwise, the SNP wouldn't get any votes at all. But they do have an influence. There's no question. It sort of reminds me of, I think it was John F. Kennedy, just after I think he became president, and somebody said that there was somebody drowning and he walked across the water and he rescued this poor soul. And the next day, the headlines in the newspapers were, President Kennedy can't swim. It sounds a bit like that, i.e., how can I find something negative? Yeah. It's part of the problem, though, that some members of the press, if not the majority, are statistically, they don't have statistical literacy.
Well, that is a problem, certainly, because when they say there's been a drop in performance on some measure, and it's 1 or 2 percentage points, well within the variability that would happen in the kind of sample sizes that they're talking about. So you're right. I mean, statistical significance is something which seems to have escaped many of the commentators. But generally speaking, I mean, what's the explanation for this? I mean, we've heard about the Scottish cringe. Why this cringe, and why in particular in education? It's interesting. I mean, I love Robert Burns, and in his To a Louse, the well quoted phrase. I mean, oh, what some power of the gift to gie us to see ourselves as others see us. It's a wonderful kind of call upon us. But normally, of course, in the poem, it's about bringing down the high and mighty, because actually people see them somewhat differently. What I would like is that people would see ourselves as others see us in a positive manner. That instead of seeing ourselves as having a kind of broken system, to actually have a system that we should be highly proud of. that's how it is seen from elsewhere.
So how do you think? I mean, this is not education now, but education is your profession. You're an expert. It's clear from tonight's discussion that you are in the creme de la creme here. And anyone, by the way, sparing your blushes, David, anyone who wants information, David will give us the details and we'll make sure you have access to those. But you've also got this broadcast of it, right? So you've got an acknowledged world expert saying that Scottish education is a success, not because he says it's a success, because he's simply reiterating what other people are saying, right? That's what's so crucial about this. Somebody has just written to us saying, good evening, folks. Your show is awesome because every week you get guests on that I could listen to for hours. Listen to David. This will be on YouTube. Go to YouTube. If you've got friends and associates or people who are not particularly enthusiastic about changes in the Constitution, you can show them this broadcast. You can say, there you are. Don't take my word for it. The statistics are all there if you care to look at them. Now, of course, it's always free to somebody to criticize something,
of course,
wherever it is. And there'll always be, as David said, problems here, there, and everywhere. But we're looking at the big picture now.
Yeah.
And very often when people are talking about subjects like education, it's the big picture that troubles them, and that's what they need to know about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the strengths of, there are many strengths. I would cite, of course, the particular strength in the quality of the teaching profession itself. We have a long history of educational strength, and that is at least acknowledged when people are saying, we've gone down the tubes because we used to be great. That sort of awareness, and I think it's true that there's a sort of social and cultural importance attached to education in Scotland, and within that there are certain aspirations that I think are distinctive. And one of those aspirations is a kind of egalitarianism. Fairness and egalitarianism is part and parcel of that. But we have to emphasize that the Scottish education system is a system and it has been separate forever. There's never been a British education system. And so whenever you see, this is a warning for anyone looking at the media when it comes to reports on education, whenever you see something about the British education system, then you've got to apply a major pinch of salt, because there isn't a British education system. Scottish education is separate and distinctive. And the strengths are distinctive. Our professional body for teachers is a fundamental thing. Now, here's an interesting fact. When the Conservative government came into power in 2010, the first Secretary of State for Education was a certain Michael Gove, and his chief advisor was Dominic Cummings. There you are. Now, do you know what one of his first acts was as Secretary for Education, the Education Secretary in the David Cameron government? One of his first acts was to abolish the recently formed, and I emphasize recently formed because it was formed during the Labour administration, General Teaching Council for England, the professional body for teachers in England, was abolished by Michael Gove almost as soon as he came in the door. Why did he do that? Well, the reforms he was wanting to bring in, kind of pseudo-marketization of education, he was envisaging at least some opposition from the profession. So deprofessionalize the profession was his instinct. Of course, deregulation is the theme of that government to this day, and their key project Brexit was about deregulation. But he applied that to education right from the start. So much so that in their flagship kind of schools, the so-called academy schools, they have freedom to employ anyone they like as a teacher. You don't have to have a formal qualification to teach. If you're educated yourself, then you can teach other people. It's not a problem. What's the issue? This is something we've grappled with in Scotland since the early 19th century, when the first teacher education institutions were being established, 1830s and so on. David Stowe, the work of the pioneers in teacher education, which were saying very clearly, people need to be trained to do this job. It's not something you can just do.
It's terribly ironic in a way, because Gove himself is a beneficiary of the Scottish educational system. So
we have, we've got to, yes, well, I'm not going to comment on that.
I want to take a couple of quick questions, if I may. Alistair Bryan is asking, what can we do to encourage more Scots to go to university?
Well, we already have a very healthy proportion of the population going to university. And one success over recent years has been in making some inroads into the disparity of access that is associated with social inequality. How can we improve that situation? Well, we can continue with some of the things that are being successful. I could highlight one or two particular initiatives. A project that is close to my heart because there was a lot of work done at Strathclyde on this, going back over the last probably more than 10 years. Actually, it's more like 15 years. The so-called intergenerational mentoring project, which some viewers might be aware of, but let me explain a little what that's about. Basically, what it was designed to do was to target and support young people in secondary schools where they were identified by their teachers as having the capability for progressing ultimately to higher education, but who had no kind of context of support. You could call it social capital to enable them or kind of support them through that process of accessing higher education. So what it did was it paired up people retired, largely people with time on their hands, who had been through the system, who were professionals across the range of different disciplines, paired them up with such pupils in areas of, let's say, social challenge, and provided a kind of one-to-one mentoring arrangement on a regular basis. And this was a long-term commitment that the mentors were giving. So they would meet, for example, someone who might come from a particular area of deprivation, let's say, where there's been no tradition of going to university, but who's really doing well at school, could really thrive with the challenge of going further, and has an aspiration to do medicine, to study medicine, become a doctor. So the mentoring project would put that pupil in touch with somebody who is a medic, who's come through the system. And instead of, obviously in a middle class area, there'll be someone's uncle or a neighbor or someone who's a professional in the cognate area. and they can say, well, if you're going to be applying, you'll need to prepare yourself for an interview, and the kind of interview you're going to get will be, and they can give them advice about that kind of thing, and their studying and so on, what's required. So that can be provided.
That sounds
that was
very
an initiative,
sensible.
and it's been very, very successful.
There's another question has come in about, somebody says, the only area that I think is wrong is the lack of polytechnic type schooling for practical pupils from 14 onward.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we have not valued vocational and practical subjects as much as perhaps we should. I'm thinking of the kind of areas that are highly valued and much more prized and recognized as worthwhile in other comparable countries. For example, if you take something like, now I know about this because over the last year we had, it's an old stone-built house we have here. It's a sandstone edifice, and needed repairs to the stonework. And we had some stonemasons come to help, and we were blessed with the expertise of the stonemason and his apprentice. It was a he, and the apprentice was such a joy to get to know, and it was very interesting because in his class, when they started, it was a 4-year apprenticeship at one of the local colleges. He had 11 colleagues start out that course, and he was now in his 4th year of the apprenticeship. And he was going variously a day a week and various other kind of things to college, but during his 4th year it's mostly in the field. And he said they were down to 3. It just hadn't, there was only a small number. Now, to me, this is nonsense. Why are we not nurturing more people into such positions? Because this particular young man has a fantastic future ahead of him. And interestingly, a note about Brexit and the loss of Erasmus, which is a tragedy for education that's been foisted upon us through Brexit. During his previous year, this apprentice had the benefit of a visit, or it was a long-term exchange from French apprentice stonemasons. And of course, the heritage industry in France and in other countries, across Europe, is a major employer. And they came to Glasgow to have an international exchange experience in stonemasonry. And sadly, obviously the pandemic came along as well, and that even before the loss of Erasmus, this young man's opportunity to go back to France and learn about how things are done there was lost. But in my view, we could do a lot more to foster practical vocational skills, and I think that's a project that we ought to embark on. And I think in an integrated way, if we have full economic control in an independent country, I think it's the kind of thing that we should prioritize for the future.
That makes sense to me, because I did a 5-year apprenticeship. It was, I found it enriching and rewarding. It was probably 2 years too long. So in effect, it meant I was providing cheap labor for 2 years. But
yeah.
So it's one of these things that has to be carefully managed
properly.
Yeah. Look, we're running out of time a little bit here, but I'd like to ask you to develop a little bit more your thoughts on independence What sort of independent Scotland would you like to see? How would it, are there anything that you would like to see fundamentally changed? You know, if, for example, if you were the first Prime Minister of Scotland, and that act takes place tomorrow morning, what would your priorities be?
Goodness, I would, you know, if I confine myself to education, let me say, with all of the economic levers in our hands, I think I could encourage my colleagues to consider carefully what the priorities should be in education, and I would look for further investment. So, for example, we can take a fairly radical look at how education is organised in Scotland. One potential example of change would be to look at the starting age for formal schooling, which has been a bit of a hot potato and under discussion over the last several years. And the issue, of course, is resources, because the evidence is very clear that delaying the start of formal education, far from disadvantaging children, actually confers advantages, as is shown in the countries where they wait till 6 or 7 for formal education to start. But the key point about these countries, if you take Norway, for example, and a lot is said about the quality of kindergarten education, and it's 6 is the starting age for formal education, or 6 or even 7 in some of the Scandinavian countries. But the point is, what happens before that age is high quality kindergarten with very favorable ratios. The staff to pupil ratio is extremely favorable. A staff member may only have 4 or 5 children to deal with. So the opportunities to engage in rich experiences, particularly out of doors and using the environment and so on, with that sort of number of those sorts of ratios, much more can be done. If we try to introduce those kind of approaches into schools as they are constituted just now, with say 20 in a class in the early stages, or maybe around that number, what you can do is totally different. It would need to be, it needs to be, if that's going to happen, it needs resources. So I think it's about, let's look at our own priorities. What are our priorities for the future? What do we need? What do children want? What do they need? What do they tell us they would like? I would listen to those voices, and I would hope that together we can maintain the momentum and continue the positive progress that is being made.
Well, I know when I speak to 5-year-olds and ask them what they want to do, they say, I want to play.
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that play-based approaches, and in fairness to early stage, those who are working in early stages, much has been done to enhance the experience in the early stages of schooling, to learn from the preschool kind of approaches that colleagues have developed over the years, and there have been improvements as a result of that. But I think, given the constraints of the number of classes, the number of teachers that we have, and so on, that it's very difficult to go really far beyond that, and much more can be done. And when children are ready to move on, when they reach that degree of maturity, then they do really well. And I'm most encouraged. I mean, the capabilities of children are astonishing. The more we study what children are capable of doing, the more we understand that they are absolutely capable of so much more than people ever assumed. I have two granddaughters who actually live in Wales. My son has moved various places, and that's where they live now. They've moved from, their journey has been quite interesting, actually, their school journey, because they started out going to school, their first experiences were actually in Stornoway, in the Outer Isles. Then they moved down to central England, and now they've moved to Wales. And they're learning, they're there only just over a year, and they're learning in Welsh language. They're in a Welsh language medium school. One is they're 5 and 7, just about coming up to 6 and 8. They're both fluent now in Welsh. They are going to be growing up bilingual, which confers fantastic cognitive advantages. Children are superbly capable. There are some who even advocate we should lower the voting age to the age of 6. How about that for a suggestion?
Well, maybe some of the MPs were 6, it might be an improvement. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that always
going with that.
I know that one of the things that always astonished me was the facility that very young children have for language. I mean, I have actually watched young children change language in mid-sentence. Yep. Now, that's beyond the reach of many grown-ups, I have to say.
Absolutely. No, we had a colleague working with us in one of our big research initiatives from Finland. She was a superb colleague, responsible for all kinds of the technical innovations that we were trying to make at that time. We were working on kind of trying to get collaborative models of research going in education, including virtual research environments. And, this is way back before this kind of Zoom environment. Anyway, she was determined that her daughter was going to be bilingual. And so she spoke entirely in Finnish to her daughter, and her husband spoke in English because he was an English speaker. And she was utterly bilingual. She was completely bilingual. And it was very interesting at school. She was in school in Scotland. She was exceptionally good at spelling. She was, she would have won any of these spelling bees that they have in the States and so on, hands down. She was fantastic at spelling. And of course, English language is notoriously difficult because of the orthography is odd. There isn't a phonetic pattern that makes everything predictable. But she devised a kind of plan, which was to phonetically, because Finnish is quite phonetic, to convert the word into Finnish, and then get a clue as to the spelling through Finnish. And I couldn't understand how she did it. I mean, she tried to explain it to me several times, and I never understood it. But whatever she did, it was wonderful. It really worked. They are fantastic. Children are just amazing.
It is the most extraordinary thing. We've only got a couple of minutes left, Donald, and I'm deeply appreciative to you for sharing your expertise and knowledge with us, and I'm sure everyone in the audience agrees with me. Yeah, I'd just like to end on your views on independence.
Yeah.
There's obviously a school of thought that says things are chaotic, Brexit is a mess, the time will never be better than to go for independence now. If we tarry and wait for some process of some kind, whether it be a referendum or otherwise, that's a missed opportunity. Where do you stand on that?
I am very, very keen that we do get moving to build up the campaign towards an early referendum. I do think we need to have a referendum at some point because we have to establish the legitimacy. And I know the legal arguments for just declaring independence and so on, and it's been well rehearsed. But at some point, a referendum has to take place. So in my view, we need to start a campaign. We need to try to create a grassroots kind of, well, build on what is already there in the grassroots activity. We need to collaborate. I haven't talked about collaboration tonight, my pet subject. We need to find ways to collaborate effectively and not allow the those who are intent on dividing, those who are in favor of independence, trying to divide and rule. It's clearly not a helpful strategy. We must work together across as wide a kind of segment of our society as possible in order to build the campaign, because we want a clear majority to be in favor of the idea. That to start an independent country without a clear majority in favor, to me, is not the right way. But I believe that that can be achieved, and I believe it can be achieved within the timescales imagined, so that, for example, that this might happen within, let's say, a year or just a year or two from now. So 2023 seems to be a good date to achieve this. And take advantage of the opportunities we have now, but we need to be working at it. We need to be working across the board collaboratively in order to get this campaign and to make the kind of points that we need to have the opportunity to make our own decisions, to reflect the reality that Scotland is a different place from elsewhere.
That's excellent. Thanks, Donald. Thanks for that. It's much appreciated. Well, there you are, folks. A big thank you for joining us tonight, and a huge thank you to Professor Donald Christie. I expect, like me, you've learned a lot tonight. And how different the reality is from what you may have seen in the public prints, or dare I say it, on our local broadcaster. Again, a big thank you. Hope you've enjoyed this show. As always, we have a formidable list of guests lined up for future shows. Thank you for your kind comments tonight. We're back next week at the same time with another special guest and someone I think you're really going to enjoy in the way that you enjoyed Professor Christie tonight, but in a different context. Amir Anwar is joining us, the lawyer, controversial lawyer, some say, is here next week at 7 o'clock. And I hope you'll be able to join us for that. As always, do look out for the Constitution column in the Sunday National. I think the editor is going to revamp the 7 days section where the Constitutional column resides. So it may look slightly different this week, but I hope you'll head for that, because I will be laying in to the BBC. Now, you may say, gracious John, that's an awfully easy target. Nonetheless, somebody needs to do it. And if you like the column, let the editor know. Thanks again, and a good night. And join us next Wednesday, please. And remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. Boris Johnson claimed that the SNP support is down. And here's an exclusive. Later this month, there's a new panel-based poll showing the SNP vote is up. How could Boris possibly be wrong? To all of you, thank you for joining us. Stay safe, take care. See you next week.